The jungle of Tharos was alive with sounds that never rested. Trees taller than towers leaned over each other, their heavy branches dripping with mist. Strange birds with crystal-colored wings darted between the leaves, and the air carried the sharp smell of damp soil and wild flowers. For the human expedition crew, every step through this alien world was both discovery and danger. Among them walked Lyra, a young girl of the native tribe, who had agreed to guide the humans through the tangled forest paths. She was cautious but curious, her wide eyes watching how the strangers from the stars moved with clumsy boots and heavy tools. Though her people distrusted outsiders, she had felt something different in the humans, especially in the tall one. With steady eyes who always spoke gently to her, never with command, but with patience. He carried himself not like a conqueror, but like someone searching for understanding. The group moved along the shadowy trail when it happened. A sudden hiss broke the still air, and from the undergrowth, a long serpent as black as night shot forward. Its scales shimmered with an oily glow, and its fangs dripped with a venom that every native of Tharos feared. Before anyone could react, the serpent struck. Lyra let out a cry as the creature's fangs sank into her leg, the force knocking her to the ground. The serpent slithered away into the foliage, vanishing like a phantom, leaving behind only the mark of its deadly bite. The humans rushed to her side, their voices filled with alarm, but the girl's people who had been following at a distance stood frozen. Their faces turned pale, and some even stepped back. For them, this was not a wound. It was a death. Sentenced. The human with the steady eyes knelt beside Lyra. He pressed his hand against her trembling arm, his face tightening as he saw the spreading darkness beneath her skin. The venom was already working, running through her veins like fire. Around him, the natives whispered to each other in their own tongue, their voices heavy with sorrow. One of them muttered that the girl was gone already. Another said no healer could fight the serpent's poison, but the human shook his head. He looked at Lyra, who stared back at him with fear but also trust. He would not let her slip away, not while breath remained in her body. Her people might have accepted death as certain, but humans had never been a species to surrender easily. He lifted his eyes toward the tribe that watched with hopeless silence, and though his words were quiet, they cut through the heavy air. "She will not die," he said. The aliens looked at him with disbelief. No one had ever lived after such a bite. But in that moment, under the dripping canopy of the alien jungle, the story of a fight against the impossible had begun. The girl lay trembling on the soft ground, her skin turning pale while her breaths grew weaker with every passing moment, and the dark veins of poison spread like ink through her leg and up toward her chest, making the humans fear they were already too late. Around them, the tribe gathered in a half circle, their eyes filled with both sorrow and certainty, for they had seen this venom before, and they knew no one returned once it took hold. The chief of the tribe, an older figure with scars across his arms and the heavy weight of tradition in his gaze, raised his hand and told the humans to step back, his voice steady as stone when he declared that the girl's time was finished, and that nothing could be done but to let her spirit pass peacefully into the next world. The human with steady eyes did not move. He only pressed his hand firmer on the wound, as if holding back the venom by will alone. And his voice came out calm yet sharp when he said that on his world, people did not simply lie down to die when bitten or poisoned. They fought, they tried, they used whatever they could until the very last moment. The tribe murmured in shock at his defiance, some with anger and others with faint wonder, for never had an outsider spoken against the word of their chief. The man's fellow explorers shifted uneasily, torn between respecting the tribe's customs and following the instinct that told them he was right. The chief stepped closer, his shadow falling across the girl, and in a low voice heavy with finality. He warned the human that touching the venom or trying to fight it would only bring more death, that the poison of the black serpent burned through the body of any who dared interfere, and that tradition demanded they let it run its course. The human lifted his eyes, meeting the gaze of the chief without fear, and answered that humans had faced venom before, on their own world where snakes and scorpions and other killers had long tested their courage, and while many had fallen, others had survived because they refused to surrender. His words carried through the clearing like fire, and the tribe fell silent, for they could not deny the strength in his tone nor the determination in his eyes. He bent lower, speaking softly to the girl, telling her she must hold on, telling her that she was stronger than this poison, and though her lips trembled and her breath rattled, her small hand rose to grip his wrist with surprising strength, as if to say she wanted him to keep trying, that she did not wish to be abandoned. That moment stirred something, even in the hearts of the tribe who had already turned their backs, for it was rare for one bitten to still show the will to fight. The human began preparing himself, remembering how long ago on Earth he had seen his father treat a snakebite with simple means, how he had learned that sometimes the body could be given a chance if the venom was drawn out before it spread too far. And though he had no tools here, only his bare hands and his stubborn heart, he chose to do the only thing he could think of. He pressed his lips to the wound and began to draw, spitting the black liquid onto the ground and again drawing faster, harder, even as the burning taste filled his mouth and his stomach twisted in warning. Gasps rang through the tribe, horrified at what they saw, believing he was only poisoning himself for nothing, yet unable to look away as his every action seemed to spit in the face of their ancient fear. The chief cried out that he was a fool, that he was only adding another death to their sorrow, but the man ignored him, his focus locked on the girl's face, watching the rise and fall of her chest, clinging to the hope that she might breathe. Easier if he endured. Sweat rolled down his face, his jaw ached, and his arms shook, but he did not stop. For every time he paused, he thought he saw the faintest flicker of life remain in her eyes, and that was enough to keep him going. The jungle around them grew quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath to see if this human's defiance could break the grip of fate. The night seemed to grow heavier as the man continued his desperate work, the shadows of the jungle closing around the clearing while the faint glow of alien fireflies drifted between the trees as if they too were watching in silence. The girl's body shook in pain, her breathing shallow and uneven, her skin glistening with sweat as the poison kept pressing against her veins, and still the human would not stop. His lips were numb, his tongue burned, his stomach churned with sickness, yet his mind pushed forward, clinging to a memory of a distant childhood on Earth, when his grandfather had told him that sometimes survival depended not on strength or weapons, but on sheer refusal to give up, on holding on when everything told you to let go. That memory now became his shield, and with it he fought the invisible enemy that ran inside the girl's blood. Around him the tribe grew restless, whispering among themselves in disbelief, unable to understand how this outsider could risk so much for one who was not even of his kind. Some called him mad, saying no one could challenge the serpent's venom, while others looked at the girl's face and wondered if perhaps there was something different in the way humans fought against fate. The chief stood apart, his arms crossed, his jaw tight, his pride caught between the certainty of his people's laws and the growing unease that perhaps the man's defiance carried a truth they had ignored. The human felt the fire spreading into his own blood now, a dull ache crawling up his throat and into his chest, warning him that he had taken too much of the poison himself. But when his hands trembled and his sight blurred, he forced himself to stay steady, whispering again and again that he would not let her go. The girl opened her eyes weakly, and though her lips could not form words, her hand found his arm and held it with what little strength she had, and that fragile touch lit a spark inside him, stronger than any fear. He told her softly to keep holding on, that she was not alone, that humans did not abandon those who placed their trust in them. Time dragged like a weight on every breath, each second stretching longer as if the night would never end. His fellow explorers shifted at the edges of the crowd, ready to pull him away before he collapsed. But they too could not bring themselves to break the chain of determination that bound him to the girl. He spat again and again, each time hoping the black liquid lost its strength, each time praying her chest would rise a little steadier. His head spun, the world tilted, but he pressed his forehead to her arm and swore to himself that if she lived, he would carry any sickness in her place. The chief finally stepped closer, his voice no longer stern but heavy with something almost like doubt, and he asked why the man did this, why he risked his own life for a child who was not of his people, who carried no bond to him. The human lifted his face, pale and sweating, and answered with a voice hoarse but unshaken, that where he came from life was worth fighting for, no matter whose it was, that no person should be left to die if there was even a chance to save them, and that he would rather fall beside her than stand back and do nothing. The words struck the tribe like thunder, for never before had they heard such a creed spoken with such fire, and though they had believed themselves hardened by centuries of loss, something in those words cracked the stone of their certainty. The girl's chest rose again, slow but stronger than before, and though her eyes rolled shut, she was still breathing. The man sagged forward, his arms barely holding him up, but even as his body threatened to fail, he felt a small hope rising. A fragile light in the endless dark, and it was enough to make him continue the fight. The night deepened, and the forest seemed to fall into a strange silence, as if every living creature was waiting to see the end of this desperate struggle, and the human's body grew weaker with each moment, for the venom he had drawn into himself now coursed through his blood like fire, and every muscle burned as though set aflame. Yet still, he would not release his hold on the girl, for to him giving up would be the same as betraying her trust. His breath came heavy and ragged, and the sweat pouring from his face fell onto the earth in steady drops while his arms trembled under the weight of exhaustion, but his mind clung stubbornly to the thought that if he could endure just a little longer, then perhaps she might yet see another dawn. The girl lay in a half-waking dream between life and death, her small body shivering in waves of pain, but her spirit clung to the faint warmth of the human's presence, and though her eyes fluttered closed, her fingers never released their grip on his wrist, as if even in weakness she had chosen to believe in him when no one else did. Around them the tribe stood in tense silence, and for the first time in their long memory, they felt uncertainty toward their own beliefs, because they had always said no one could defy the black serpent's venom, yet here before their eyes a human stranger was refusing that truth, and by doing so he was shaking the pillars of their old traditions. Some of the younger warriors looked at one another with unease and wonder, while the elders muttered that this was only madness and would end in 2 deaths instead of 1, but none of them could bring themselves to step forward and stop him. The man's fellow explorers wanted to rush to his side, for they saw how pale his skin had grown and how his lips had darkened from the poison he had swallowed, yet something in his eyes told them he would not allow interruption, and so they remained, back torn between fear for him and awe at the unbroken will he displayed. The chief of the tribe finally stepped forward, his voice heavier than before, his pride warring with the sight of what was unfolding, and he demanded to know if the human truly understood the cost he was paying, if he was ready to give his own life away for someone who was not his blood, not his kin, not even his kind. The human raised his head, though his vision spun, and his chest heaved, and with a voice rough with pain, he answered that it did not matter if she was his kin or not, because life itself was sacred, and he would rather suffer than see a child's light extinguished when he still had strength to fight for it. His words carried into the hearts of every listener stronger than any cry of victory, and in that moment, the tribe felt their old certainty. tremble like a wall struck by a storm. The man bent again to his task, drawing out the venom with lips numb and tongue burning, his body shaking as the sickness crept deeper inside him, and though every nerve screamed for him to stop, he pressed on his heart, fueled by a fire that no poison could extinguish. The girl's breathing steadied faintly, her chest rising more evenly, and the dark color that had spread across her skin slowed its climb as if the venom was losing its strength against the human's relentless effort. Gasps broke through the tribe, for they had never seen such a thing, and for the first time they whispered not words of doom, but words of hope. Yet the human could not feel triumph, for his own body was betraying him. Now his arms weak, his knees buckling, his sight dimming to shadows, but he refused to release the girl's arm. He refused to fall until he knew she was safe, and with one last surge of will he spat the venom to the earth and pressed his forehead against her hand, whispering a promise that she would live. His body finally gave way, and he collapsed beside her, his chest still rising but faintly, and the tribe rushed forward, caught between fear and awe, for they saw that both lay together on the ground, one fragile child and one broken human, and they did not know if either would wake with the light of morning. The first light of dawn spread through the canopy of the jungle, and golden beams slipped between the giant trees, touching the clearing, where silence had ruled through the long hours of the night. And as the tribe gathered around the two still figures on the ground, their hearts pounded with both fear and wonder, for they had never before seen anyone last so long after the serpent's bite, and they could not decide if the girl and the human had crossed into death, or if they were clinging stubbornly to life. The chief stood tall, yet uncertain, for his people were looking at him for guidance, but even he could not explain what his eyes were showing him. The girl stirred first, her eyelids fluttering against the glow of morning, her lips parting with a weak breath that was steadier than it had been in the night, and the faint color that had returned to her cheeks was enough to make the tribe gasp aloud in disbelief, because no one, no memory, no story in their long history had ever spoken of someone who lived after the black serpent's strike. She turned her head slowly and saw the human lying beside her, his chest rising with shallow breaths, his skin pale as ash, and though she was weak, her small hand reached for his arm, as if to remind herself that he was real, and not a dream of her fading mind. The human's fellow explorers rushed to his side, trying to lift him, but his eyes opened before they could move him, and though his voice was hoarse and heavy, he spoke softly, asking only if the girl was alive. When they told him she was breathing, he let out a broken laugh and whispered that the fight had been worth every drop of pain, because life had been given back where it was thought impossible. The tribe stood frozen, their old beliefs crumbling before their eyes, for the proof lay in the child's breathing, and in the stubborn human who had refused to accept fate. The chief stepped forward, his face no longer hard with pride, but softened with respect, and he knelt down before the human, something none of his people had ever seen him do, and with a voice that trembled more than he wished, he declared that the courage and will of this man had broken the curse of the serpent, and had shown that perhaps the laws of death were not as unshakable as they had always believed. He told his people that from this day forward, they would not look at humans as frail outsiders, but as a people whose hearts carried a strength that even poison could not destroy. The girl whispered faintly that she owed her life to the human, and though her words were weak, they carried into the circle of the tribe like a song of hope, and for the first time many of them felt pride rather than fear when they looked at her, for she had become living proof that the impossible could be undone. The explorers watched as the chief extended his arm toward the human in a gesture of honor and alliance, and though the man was too weak to stand, he managed a small nod and answered with quiet words that on his world life was never surrendered without a fight, because to fight for one another was what kept them human. The jungle filled with the sound of wind moving through the branches, and the tribe lowered their heads, not in mourning as they had expected, in respect for the man who had refused to bow to fate, The girl smiled faintly at his side, her strength slowly returning while his body rested and healed, and in that moment, a bond was born. Between two peoples, one forged not by fear or power but by the relentless will of a single human, who had shown them that hope could outlast even Venom. And so with the rising sun, the story ended not in loss, but in the birth of new trust and the memory of one night, when humanity proved again why it could never be broken. The end.